As was stated in a previous video, you see the rise of abolitionism, that is to say, this social movement that emerged, whose agenda was to abolish slavery in the United States. Now, it should be noted that one important legacy of the American Revolution itself was this idea of the end of slavery, right? Not that it was widely accepted, but it was at least entertained by some, a minority, of course, by some, that freedom should apply to persons of African descent, African Americans, right? Not just to Americans. So this was the, if you will, the nascent stage, the formative stage of abolitionism right after the American Revolution, but it gains traction as a social movement through the ensuing decades. And certainly by the end of the 18th century, the first few decades of the 19th century, you see anti slavery societies start to um, gain more prominence in the United States. Now, this early approach to abolitionism is different from what it would evolve into. At first, you see this more, if you will, conservative approach. That is to say, they did not believe in immediate abolitionism. They did not believe in immediate freedom to be given to slaves. Why? They felt that, that might be too foolhardy, that it would obviously engender a host of economic and political problems. So the best approach was to take a gradual approach, gradualism, if you will. That's to say, take steps towards emancipation of slaves. Now, one example of this idea, let's call it the conservative approach, was the strategy of, quote, colonization. And basically, the idea behind colonization was to take freed slaves to places which were their ancestral homeland. Now, I say ancestral homeland when in fact, let's remember that most slaves back then had, families stretching back generations. So it's hard to argue that. But nonetheless, it's felt that, for example, take freed slaves back to Africa, or at the very least to parts of the Caribbean where you have, very prominent numbers of persons of African descent, right? So you see, for example, the American Colonization Society, a very prominent abolitionist group, advocating colonization and actually practicing it. The famous example here is the establishment of Liberia. Liberia is still a nation today, but the beginnings of Liberia as a nation was exactly a place to send freed African Americans and sending them back to Africa, right? Notice the term Liberia, or the word Liberia, excuse me, has liberty as its root, right? Liberia. In fact, the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, still today, right? And Monrovia is named after President Monroe. Okay, so that's the practice of colonization, and it's supported by some abolitionists, um, certainly some prominent politicians and leaders at the time. But how do you think free blacks felt about colonization? Again, free blacks we discussed last time, right? Or African Americans who were not enslaved, a very small population, but nonetheless, they are here at the time, and to be sure, some supported it. And that's evidenced by Liberia itself, the Liberia experiment, so to say. Yet, we should also take note of this fact that even in 1817, very early on, we see the first National Free Black Convention being held. And you see about 3,000 attendees here. And what they argued was that African Americans, or let's just use the word Negro that they used back then, Negroes were Americans, and therefore they're entitled to the same freedom and rights enjoyed by other Americans. Okay, so again, some supported colonization, but many felt no, America was their place, their country. Now, what happens here is after 1830, abolitionism not only gains traction, but it also becomes more militant. As stated in the slide, um, they become more militant because, number one, there's a strong sense of moralism behind abolitionism. Even before, in the beginnings, it was this moral imperative that drove abolitionists into action as a part of civil society, right? But because of the strong feeling that slavery was the most heinous, most evil, the most corrupt institution afflicting our society, that it was pathological and, something that is indicative of the moral degeneration and decay, again, afflicting our country, it should be terminated and eradicated immediately. So, in other words, how you think of militant abolitionism is to throw out the idea of gradualism out the window, right? They advocate the immediate end of slavery. Why? Because again, there's a lot of religious overtones here, strong moralistic overtones. The idea that slavery is this grave sin that's afflicting our society. But they also appeal to political beliefs that are more secular. For example, the Declaration of Independence, right? That all men are created equal. So that's still part of it. Now, by the way, when they do this, the South becomes paranoid in a sense that they're being attacked because they are being attacked from outsiders within the nation as well as without. That is to say, from foreign countries that have already prohibited slavery. Now, besides Frederick Douglass and many other famous abolitionists at the time, probably the most prominent one was William Lloyd Garrison. And he's definitely militant. Okay, he started this abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator and became well known throughout the country. And of course, it was subject to sabotage, and Garrison was threatened with his life numerous times. He had to basically escape from angry mobs who wanted to kill him when he was speaking in public. But here's a famous quote by him: "I will be as harsh as truth and uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Because this really reflects his, strong sense of moralism, right? So, Garrison and other abolitionists would actually try to use a particular tactic here, not only using, quote, print technology, right, like the newspaper, but also they wanted to persuade Americans based on their moralism. To use the term moral suasion, that's spelled Suasion, moral suasion. They did not advocate, for the most part, violence. They did not believe in slave rebellion. Most of them were indeed pacifist. Rather, they tried to appeal to the person's sense of morality, right? That this is something we just must do because it's obvious that it is unjust, that is immoral. Imagine, for example, today, if things like child trafficking was legal, even though it was highly condemned. Well, it's obvious today that this is indeed an immoral institution, and all we have to do is convince others to make it illegal, right? So it's similar in context, at least, back then with the abolitionists. Now, here we have to note this important fact that the abolitionists are arguing something that even the founding fathers did not argue and did not actually believe in, this idea of universal freedom in the United States. Okay, so let's recall that the founding fathers were suspicious of democracy. In fact, as we discuss, the Constitution, if we look at it through race, gender, and class, it leaves out four classes, which combined are definitely the majority of the people in the United States in 1789 when the Constitution was ratified. That is to say, it leaves out African Americans, it leaves out Native Americans, Indians, it leaves out women, who are about half the population, and it leaves out men who did not own land, white men who did not own land. So it's very exclusive, not inclusive. But the abolitionists are actually advocating something called, or let's just say it's more connected to our modern ideas about universal freedom. So this is compelling. We owe more to the abolitionists than to our founding fathers when it comes to our ideas, our modern ideas of universal freedom. So now our topic of discussion and analysis is going to be focused on the growing sectionalism by the late 1840s, and certainly into the 1850s, and this actually explodes into the Civil War by 1861. Now, let me remind you what sectionalism refers to. It's when political division, political rivalry, is based upon geography or region. And it's obviously the case in this context that we're talking about North versus South. And of course, we're talking about the free North, no slavery, versus the slave South, where slavery is openly practiced. Now, a good entry point into this topic is the territory that will be gained from the U.S. Mexico War, otherwise known as the Mexican American War. And this territory will happen, or actually be gained by 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the war. Now, first of all, why do we enter this war? Well, we always looked interestedly at the Western lands, which was actually owned by Mexico. And we even offered to buy it from Mexico, but of course, they rejected our offer. So at one point, it was accused, or let's just say that the United States government accused some Mexican troops of crossing the border in this area southward. And because of that, war erupted. Now, with this war's ending, and the United States won it handily, we see a condition being made that the territory that we always found attractive be ceded now to the United States. So this territory in yellow here is now part of the United States by 1848. But this is the big issue. With the debate surrounding the treaty itself, the question is, were these new lands gained from the war, were they to resemble the North, that is to say, the free North, or were they to resemble the slave South? Now, this became the explosive issue, and it was particularly due to a proviso that was advanced by this senator. His name was Wilmot, Wilmot. So this is the well-known Wilmot Proviso. And he basically, during this negotiations surrounding, the territory, he advanced a resolution into Congress whereby saying that Slavery should be prohibited from all territory acquired from Mexico, all this yellow area here. Now, what does this result in? Well, previous to 1848, sure, there was a lot of sexualism, but that wasn't the main source of political rivalry. It was still based on the party system. That is to say, the second party system where you had two parties, the Whig Party versus the Democratic Party. All right. The Whig Party, by the way, is spelled WHIG. The Whig Party tended to advocate more larger government. Democratic Party is associated with Jackson again, right? And this idea of states' rights and smaller government. But nonetheless, that was the source or the root of political rivalry. Just like today, it's based on the party system, as you know, the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party today, right? So it was similar back then in that context prior to 1848. But once you enter that proviso, it makes sexualism the main source of political division, North versus South. Another way to make sense of this is this, that when it comes to party division rather than sectional division, well, there's the two parties, right? There's some Whigs, or there's some Whig states in the North, there's some Whig states in the South, and likewise with the Democratic Party, there's some Democrat states in the North and South. But when it's sectional, it doesn't matter, right? What matters more is geography, North versus South, regardless of whether there are some Democrats in the North or Democrats in the South. Okay, so what happens, in other words, is that sectionalism replaces that inter-party system, right? Sectionalism becomes the main source of political hostilities. Now, by the way, this hostility surrounding the Wilmot Proviso would reach a compromise, the compromise of 1850. But nonetheless, this sort of was the warning sign, right? That was to set the tone for the remainder of the 1850s. Okay, because what we'll see during the 1850s is a host of sectional conflict. I should say this before I talk about that, but sexual conflict had always been around. And if you recall, during the ratification of the Constitution itself, or even the drafting of it, the debate surrounding it, there was a sectional component to that. Let's recall the Three-Fifths Clause, right? And the abolishing of the slave trade, the African slave trade, right? But again, it's not the main source of political rivalry. But after 1848, sexualism is definitely ignited here. Now, we see some key conflicts, which I will ask you to resort to your text for these. All right, Wilmot Proviso we already talked about. But briefly summarize here, the Fugitive Slave Act. Well, in the Constitution, there was such a thing as the Fugitive Slave Law, where it is required that for all escaped slaves going to the North, that they be apprehended, and this would be backed up by law. But the law was not really practiced; it was a dead letter, so to say. And one compromise of 1850, as I just alluded to, was to breathe new life into the Fugitive Slave Act. But again, especially for abolitionists, they hate this, right? That escaped slaves in the North have to be sent back to the South. There's the famous case of Margaret Garner, who was an escaped slave and settled in a free state. But because of the Fugitive Slave Act after 1848, now that is being enforced, we see Margaret Garner choosing to murder some of her children rather than send them back into slavery. So it's very tragic, right? And that's one example. Okay, but another one was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Okay, this was kind of a mini civil war before the Civil War, where this territory not yet a part of the United States, the Kansas Territory, Nebraska Territory, had this fight about whether that territory should be free or slave. And indeed, it leads to something called Bleeding Kansas. And I earlier talked about the caning or the beating of Senator Charles Sumner, who condemned those who were advocating um, the new territory of Kansas to be slave. And then there's the Dred Scott decision, which basically Dred Scott was a slave who accompanied his slave owner to a free state up north. His slave owner dies. So Dred Scott realized he could actually sue for his freedom because he's in a free state. Now, to make the long story short, it reaches the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides that slaves cannot sue the government. Why? Because they are not citizens. So that was the basic pronouncement being made that's associated with the Dred Scott decision that slaves are not citizens. And then you have the well-known Raid of Harper's Ferry by John Brown, who was this fanatical abolitionist. People say he was kind of crazy, actually, but he had this contingent of militants who raided this place, and it led to outbreak of violence. But to some, especially some abolitionists, John Brown, even though he was, quote, crazy, he was heralded as this sort of a martyr for the cause. And then the last straw was the election of a Republican. Now, the Republican Party is not part of that two-party system I mentioned earlier, the Whigs versus the Democrats. But the Republican Party arose as an alternative party, and their agenda was this: to disallow slavery into the Western territories. So, by 1860, you have this person from a party not based on the traditional two-party system, Whigs versus Democrats, but from a third party that advocates a sectional argument. And he becomes president. Okay, this is different from the 1856 election, let alone the 1852 presidential election. Here you have a sectional president elected. So that is a direct cause of the Civil War here, politically speaking.